Today I'm going to be talking to you about an article written by Glenda Gilmore called Forging Interracial Links in the Jim Crow South. This article focuses on Charlotte Hawkins Brown and the creation and impact of her school, the Palmer Memorial Institute. Learning objectives are: who was Charlotte Hawkins Brown and what was her contribution to African Americans in the South during the Jim Crow era? What did Charlotte Hawkins Brown see as the key to change for African Americans? What were the restrictions that Charlotte Hawkins Brown was working around? Understand how Dr. Brown identified and used fault lines to her advantage. Assess the effectiveness of Gilmore's evidence. I'm going to sidetrack for just a moment to give you a little background information to make sure we're all on the same page. Gilmore's article focuses on the life of Charlotte Hawkins Brown. She lived from 1883 to 1961. She was a descendant of slaves but lived most of her childhood in New England. She was well educated and went to school to become a teacher. At 19, she founded the Palmer Memorial Institute near Greensboro, North Carolina, which became a prominent school for African Americans. When she established the school was during the time of Jim Crow laws. These were the laws that required segregation of the races after slavery was abolished. The laws acted to oppress African Americans and keep them uneducated and separate from white society. There was little to no recourse for African Americans, and many were killed for purposely or accidentally crossing these lines. To our article, the idea that Glenda Gilmore attempts to outline for us is that there were fault lines in white society that created an opportunity for Charlotte Hawkins Brown. She shows that Hawkins Brown recognized these opportunities and seized them to create an opportunity to educate the African American community. Through doing this, she was able to impact many lives and empower the next generation to continue their fight toward equality. Gilmore gives us a lot of evidence to back up her claim. She first introduces us to the fact that Charlotte, on a walk while babysitting, randomly meets Alice Freeman Palmer, who was a prominent white woman in a position of higher education. Charlotte happened to be reading a high school Latin book which caught Miss Palmer's attention. Because of the encounter and unsolicited sympathy, Miss Palmer ends up paying for Charlotte Brown Hawkins' education. Although Charlotte did not ask for or need sympathy, she did make the connection that woman will help woman. The second connection that she made was that an interest in learning and education made the two women similar and therefore created a connection that elicited support regardless of race. Author Glenda Gilmore also points out several instances where Charlotte Hawkins Brown attempts to separate herself from her own race. This could be seen as offensive, but it is shown as a method to create an acceptance of her so that she could help others. An example would be changing her name from Lottie to Charlotte, denying remembering any signs of discrimination in the South when she was growing up, and referring to whites as the protectors of African Americans. We are assuming, along with Gilmore, that she was being strategic. Strategies continued with the naming of her school after Alice Freeman Palmer, even though she had no involvement. Her pursuit of manners and etiquette, her arranging of outings so that her students did not mingle with other blacks, and arranging seating at events so that they did not come face to face with the humiliation of segregation. She was a master of playing both sides of the fence to get her desired result. She had found that women had many things in common, regardless of race, and she played upon that. Said what people wanted to hear, such as that her school was vocational, but to teach the highest standards and never assume that anyone was less capable. Likely because of the success she had at playing the Alice Freeman Palmer name to her advantage, she immediately seized the opportunity to strike up a friendship with Lula Martin McIver, who was a feminist and a strong advocate of education, but more importantly, her husband was the head of the White Women's Normal College in North Carolina and could help her with funding. She knew that a friendship with his wife would get her further than any meeting she could have on her own. Charlotte Hawkins Brown was an expert at was finding common ground with people who could and would help her. She found a common ground with women because all women at this time were oppressed to a more or lesser extent. She dispelled stereotypes of African Americans through her education and manners, and that allowed her to create supporters. This was an important part of achieving what would be her legacy. She was educating the generation that would participate in the civil rights movement and chip away at inequalities. She taught them the subtle art of making change without making waves. Student activity. Charlotte Hawkins Brown took manners and etiquette very seriously. In fact, she wrote a book entitled The Correct Thing to Do, to Say, to Wear. Lists 3 ways that manners contributed to creating alliances. Why were appearances so important for African Americans during Jim Crow South? Do you think appearances are important today? Posting the following questions for class discussion. What does Gilmore mean by fault lines? Where were the fault lines among the white population, and how did Charlotte Hawkins Brown use them to her advantage? How did Charlotte Hawkins Brown create allies? How did this undermine the Jim Crow era? Are there ways that we can apply the idea of fault lines in our own times to achieve positive change on issues that are important to us personally? The site of the Palmer Institute is now a historical site in North Carolina that includes a museum and tours. The building pictured here was the main school building that unfortunately burnt down in 1971. It said in large letters across the front over the columns, Alice Freeman Palmer.